Hello and welcome to another episode of Around the House. I'm your host, Steve O'Brien, and today's show ought to be very interesting. We're going to talk about coping, crown molding, baseboard, and chair rail. I've always wanted to do a show on crown molding. I run into more people that have more trouble installing crown molding, and it's really not that difficult, so I broke it down into a few different parts that I can show you, a few simple tricks that you can do this pretty simply at home. Again, you might need the miter saw. You can do these kind of cuts by hand. Back in the old days we actually did, but with today's tools I would recommend a compound miter saw. You can rent them. If you don't own one, you could rent one for the day. But I'll explain to you the different techniques I use on how to cut and install a crown molding first, and then we'll break down how to install a chair rail, and then we'll do a segment on baseboard. So why don't we get started? First thing I want to show you is how to lay it out before you even start to install the crown molding. Now what I normally do is I make a couple of blocks. As you can see, I label the blocks. One says wall and one says ceiling. And I have arrows indicating the direction the block will go, because when you use a block that's this size, you can get confused which, it's almost the same diameter in both directions. So if that's the case, make sure you put an arrow as a reference to where the block goes. Now I'm going to show you that in 1 second, but first, the way I determined this, I'm going to show you how I determined this. Get a scrap piece of crown molding first. Hold it up to your ceiling like that, and look at the end of the crown molding, where it meets the ceiling and where it meets the wall. Now you'll see your typical 3.5 inch crown molding, there's a flat spot on the bottom and there's a flat spot on the top. You want to make sure those are sitting flat where they're supposed to be. And this is about as flat as we can get because there's a little indentation on this sheetrock here, so it doesn't really look flat, but it is. And then what I do is I take a pencil, mark the bottom, mark the top. This is called the bottom projection. This is called the top projection. And that's very important. It's very important that you keep those lines throughout the room. So now that you have those reference lines, this is where your blocks come in. I made one up for the wall angle. It's a little bit longer than the ceiling. Two different angles, two different projections. The wall angle, as you can see my reference arrows here, you would hold it up against the wall, meet the ceiling with it, and it falls right on my pencil line that I made earlier. So we know that's our bottom projection. Same goes for the top. Go with the arrows to the wall. Either way, you can turn it around, it doesn't matter, as long as the arrow is facing the wall. And there's my pencil mark that I made on the top of the crown molding. So there you go. We have these. This is the trick. I've used this for years and it works wonders. And to try to do this without these, it's really difficult. Now, I'll show you as I do this, go around the whole room and do them intermittently throughout the room. You can do them every 2 feet, nothing critical, every 3 feet, 4 feet. But the main place you want these is in the corners. I'm going to show you. I got a pencil mark right there. And I got a pencil mark right there. And I've already got them on the ceiling, so I won't show you. I'm a little short, so it's going to be difficult for me to reach that, but take my word for it. I already marked them on the ceiling. And now, I pre-cut these moldings so we wouldn't make any dust here in the studio. So I'm going to show you the angle cut for the miter, you have to cope these, and I'm going to explain what coping means. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. I usually have 2 of these saws. These are called coping saws. I put a coarse blade in this one and a fine tooth blade in the other one. Reason being is the coarse blade gets you through the heavy material, whereas the finer blade, if you have a real sharp corner to make, the finer blade will get you around the sharp corners. So the coarse blade for the heavy material, and I'll show you, I'm going to cut it for you, and the fine blade for real fine details. So let's put this off to the side. Now, we made our miter cut on our compound miter saw back at the shop. Now what I do, first of all, the angle, which is the angle this way of the saw, which would be the miter, is approximately 32 degrees. Now you might want to check your saw. Every saw might be a little different, but my saw works pretty good on 32 degrees. Then you set the bevel, when you reach behind the saw and you tip the saw on the bevel, that bevel is usually, on my saw, it's about 35 degrees. So again, try a scrap piece. That's the only way I would recommend anybody do this. Try a scrap piece, but use those angles I gave you. That'll get you in the ballpark, and then you might have to tweak it a little bit to get it exactly to fit right. Now, the next step, after you make your angle cut, as you see here, you're ready to cope it. You have to back cut this, and I'll show you why. But I always take a pencil and I outline where my cut, right where the 2 points meet, just like that, and that gives you a nice shadow line to cut by. See, it makes it stand out a little better, so it's easier to see where your cut's got to be. Now the fun part, the coping part is probably the hardest part of the whole job. And one more trick I want to show the viewers. When you make this cut on your miter saw, one little trick I learned over the years, if this cut right here, this is the top of the crown molding, you see there's usually a large flat piece there. If you notice this here is way not square, this line here, then your cut's going to be wrong. This cut should be somewhat square, this angle right here. And if you notice, after you make a cut, that's not square, try to get that cut square. That'll tell you something's not right. Okay, so now we're going to do a little coping. Bear with me on this. This is kind of a good workout. But you want to angle the saw back so you're undercutting this way, and I'll show you when we're done why that works so good. Then you can reverse it and go the other way, because that's a sharp corner to try to turn the saw to. So I always go back into it, cut off some of the heavy stuff, and you start to come up to your line. Now you can follow your line right up to the cut, the first cut. Take your time. Nice and easy. There you go, we're getting there, see? That's the beginning of the cut. But you have to undercut it. You see how I'm undercutting that? Now we'll continue down. This is why this heavy blade works good, because it gets through the heavy meat of the wood here. Okay, now we're getting there. Now we just got a little bit more to go. Reverse it and go back into your cut. coming back the other way, just like we did on the bigger one. Then you just cut the bottom, and this is where the smaller blade will come in, because that'll break off every time and chip on you. So use the smaller blade, and you just make a little square cut on the end. And that just about finishes up what we have to do. Perfect. Now you can see the back of that cut. I don't know if you can get that on camera, if you can get the way I back cut that. And sometimes what happens, and I'll show you, when you go to connect these together, let me make sure I get it right. When you go to do these crown moldings together, however the case may be, this is a bad example. I'll show you up on the actual wall itself. Now, what we did here was we put a straight piece. Let's say this was your wall at home. You put your straight piece up first. Again, now we have these lines that we put these lines on here earlier to go by. So you follow those lines. I'm right on the lines. Okay? You nail that piece on first. That's the easy part, the square piece. Now you got to fit this piece into it. It'd be better if I put it with the way it goes. And that piece, I'm sorry, goes over this side. Now the piece we just cut would go into it like so. And there you have it. Okay? And that makes a nice looking job. Now you know the angle, because that angle worked fine. So make sure if you get the angle that you like and it worked really well, make a little pencil mark as a reference line on your saw. Maybe a little piece of tape with a pencil line on your saw to where these angles are, so every cut will stay the same. But as long as you hold those marks, those will work. But if you don't hold those marks, and if you have no way to tell, when you put the molding against the wall, like that, if you had no reference marks, you could be pushing it in that way, or you could be lifting it up too high. And if you do that, you'll never get the joint to be right. So let's say we were a little off our mark on that one, and we didn't have a mark to go by, so we said it looked good by eye, so we just nail it. Then you go to put this one into it, and that's what you're going to end up with. And then you got to try to fudge this one to fit, and it's never going to fit right. So if you don't use those marks, you're going to be asking for a world of hurt. Believe me when I tell you that, because I've corrected many a problem that people have started to do their own crown molding, and I've had to go rip half of it off just to do it with this simple little trick. And they were amazed when they seen how simple it really was. So a little reference line save you a lot of headaches. Okay, so I hope that helped you a little with the crown molding. And pretty much just find out where the studs are, every 16 inches usually. And you can usually, on the end of most walls have what they call a double plate. And that's a double 2x4 that they nail together. And that'll give you some good nailing on the bottom. You can usually put nails right in the bottom here. And that'll put in an upward motion, and that keeps that profile pretty straight for you. So that just about sums it up on the crown molding. It's really not that hard. And one more quick tip on crown molding, if I may. The hardest part there's two things in crown molding that you got to remember too. It's very easy when you go around the room. You always have one piece square cut butting the wall, and you just go either clockwise or counterclockwise, whatever your preference is in the room. So you go in square, and then you meet it, and then the next piece, you go into it with your coped edge, and you'd have a square end on that end. So you'd follow yourself around, one square edge, one cut edge. But that doesn't last for long, because when you get to the last wall, you're going to have to make one cut, and it's usually 2 miters like that, and you got to be really critical, or that's not going to fit. You don't have any leeway. So what I usually do when I have the last piece going in and it fits between two crown moldings, you got a crown molding on this side and you got a crown molding on this side. You got to cut that one piece to fit. What I do, measure from the flat spot, which is right here, to the other flat spot on the other crown molding. And that's all you do. So when you're measuring from your flat spot, the flat spot's actually going to be this point right here. So just remember, when you're measuring your crown molding, go from flat spot to flat spot on the other wall. Make it a little bit longer, and when you push it in, it'll have a little bulge in the middle. Push it tight, and it'll push in real tight. It'll be a beautiful job. Let's hope you don't have to use any white caulking, because we all do that. I know, I've done it myself, but I don't advocate using caulking. But a lot of cases you have to use white caulking, because a lot of these homes now have the stucco ceilings, which is, it's an irregular plaster. So when you go to push it up to the ceiling, sometimes there's a bump there. Those ceilings are really tough to do crown moldings on, but it can be done. A little bit of white caulking afterwards and it looks beautiful. Now, I want to touch on a few more things before we run out of time also. One other thing that's pretty common in homes today is chair rail. Many different styles, many different types. This is a very common type of chair rail that I thought I'd show you. This style here, and the name for that at the lumberyard, it's called Governor Francis chair rail. I don't know why they call it Governor Francis. Maybe he chopped down the tree, they made it from, I don't know. But if somebody knows that, there's a trivia question. Look that up and email me the answer to that. That'd be great, because I've always been told it's called Governor Francis. So anyways, it's pretty ornate. There's a lot of detail to it. And we already took the liberty to cope this one. And you can see it's a pretty sharp cope. Now that's one of the reasons I wanted you to see this fine tooth coping saw blade, because there's so many little curves and twists, and you really have to take your time on these. And what else I do is sometimes you can leave the pencil line on there after you do that. And what I do, you can use a wood file, a wood rasp, or anything like that, and you can just break that down a little bit further, especially where these little sharp angles are. The sandpaper, I use 100 grit, works fantastic. And you can back cut that a little bit more with your sandpaper. You can use a utility knife to back cut that excess wood from behind, and that'll be beautiful. Now I'm going to show you how nice this fits. Now with a chair rail, it can vary whatever height you prefer. You'd snap a chalk line, and that would establish your pencil line, I mean your line where the rail goes, and see how nice that fits? I mean, that's a perfect joint. And let me explain why we do the coping too, because you're probably out there watching saying, well, why don't I just do 2 45s and bring the 45s together? That's fine if your walls are perfectly square. But most houses, you're very lucky to get a square wall. And if you make 2 45s and you go to put them together and the walls are square, guess what's going to happen? Almost every time there's going to open up and there's going to be a big gap. And then I've seen people fill them with caulking, and it's just, for a little extra time, it's a real professional job. And if it's your own home, I mean, isn't that what you want? So that's about it for the Governor Francis chair rail. I mean, that was pretty simple. I didn't want to cut that in the studio because it would just take a little more time. Now, last but not least, again, there's so many variables with baseboard. I've done so many different types of baseboard, but this is a very common type baseboard. They used to use these when they build what they call a spec house. You can use it even in an addition or something like that. It's cheap. It's inexpensive, we'll say, not cheap, but inexpensive compared to the other types of baseboards you could use. This is called a 3.5-inch colonial. This is a pre-primed. I don't think it's finger jointed. Sometimes they finger joint these things. This one isn't finger jointed, but you can get them a little cheaper if you want to get the finger joints in them. I don't really like the finger joints. Sometimes they come through and you see them even after you put your finished coat on. So if you're doing baseboard like this and it is finger jointed, just give it a light sanding before you before you put it on. Before you put it on the wall, it'll be a little easier to sand it before you install it. And then when you put your primer finish coat on there, those little fingers that they glue together, you won't see them as much. So again, I took the liberty to coat this at the shop so we wouldn't make a mess here at the studio. And as you can see, it's a pretty simple coat. Pretty simple. Compared to the crown molding and the Governor Francis chair rail, that's a very simple coat. And again, the same thing, you put a straight piece in. Anytime you have a molding that's on the flat versus a molding that is projection at an angle, like the crown molding or a bed molding, it's so much simpler because you lay your stock on the saw flat, whereas the crown molding, you're putting a bevel on it, and there's a lot of things to really do with a crown molding. But the flat molding, pretty simple, just like that, and there you have it. And I always put, again, if you have the luxury to do that, I put the baseboard on. I'd love to put it on before the floor goes down. If you're doing carpet, yes, definitely put it down before the carpet. I usually put it down on top of the hardwood floor. Years ago, the carpenters would put the baseboard down, and then the floor would go, hardwood floor would go to it, but they'd always put like a little quarter round molding where the hardwood floor met the baseboard, because they had to leave a gap there. Anytime they do a hardwood floor, or even these new laminate floors, there's supposed to be a gap so that the floor can expand and contract and what have you. So I like to put it on top of the hardwood floor. A little more work for the carpenter, because what you have to do, if you're doing it on top of the hardwood floor, is you have to run this through the table saw, and you have to put a slight bevel, and I'll show you with a pencil. Just a slight bevel like that. You run that through your table saw, and then when you put that on your hardwood floor, if there's any, in most cases, the floor is a little bit on the wavy side, and then you take a pair of dividers, or you can even run your pencil along the floor, and it'll follow that shape of the floor, the irregularity, and you'll see it on the pencil line. And then where you've got that bevel now, like I showed you, now when you have your block plane, you're planing that, you're just taking a little tiny bit of the wood. You're not block planing a ½ inch. You're just block planing a little bit of wood, so it's a lot easier to fit that way. And then you just keep fitting it a couple of times, get it close, somewhat close, and then you're good to go. But again, with baseboard, there's many different types of baseboard. This was the most common type of baseboard. There were two common types of baseboard. This is a 3.5 colonial, and the other type is a 2.5 inch clamshell, a 3.5 inch clamshell. I'm sorry, and usually that would go with the 2.5 inch clamshell casing, which they'd put around the doors. And same as this, they'd usually use a 3.5 inch colonial casing. Now there's so many types of moldings out there. There isn't enough time in one show to go through all the different types of moldings. I'd love to do that sometime for everybody, to show all the different types of applications. Actually, I might even do a show on putting together a cornice, a box cornice. That's a beautiful thing to have in a formal dining room or a formal living room. Quite a few moldings involved. It's quite a bit of work, but the end result is absolutely beautiful. Maybe we'll do a show on that up and coming at some point. I just didn't have the setup to do that at this time, but that would be a good show. There's so much to talk about with moldings, and again, I could talk about crown molding all day long. I love crown molding. Put up quite a bit. I put up a lot in my own house. A simple crown molding can it just makes the house look so much more cozy. It breaks the ceiling line between the wall and the ceiling. It just breaks that line. And again, once you do a room or two, you become a pro at it. Drop me a line and let me know how you're making out, because I hope I could give you a few tips anyways on how easy it is. It's not really that complicated. It'd be good if you had a helper too, especially if you're doing a long run. If you have like anything over 8 feet, it helps to have somebody on the other end holding it up for you. I've actually done things by myself, long lengths, And what I've done is I've marked, again, with my reference blocks, this is the wall one, I've made these marks all along the wall. Say it's a 20-foot long wall, and I'll put maybe a small nail right on those pencil marks, and that'll hold the molding up for me. If I'm on one end, I can lift the molding up and rest it on those nails, and you can do it by yourself. There's little tricks to everything. Then all you do is afterwards, the little nail hole, you just take a little caulking and you fill the nail hole in, and you'll be good to go. So, you know, just little stuff like that. And one more quick thing with these moldings, and a lot of moldings I'd say also, is when you have to join two pieces together, we have what they called a scarf joint. Now a scarf joint, and I don't have the exact thing to show you here, but a scarf joint is like you would take your saw and you'd make a 45-degree cut. It doesn't have to be 45, but whatever that angle is, keep that as a reference. Make a cut like this. So now you have two pieces, they're coming into each other. I wish I had one I could show you, but when you make a joint, that's called a scarf joint, and the other one would come into it just like that. But you'd put this one on first, and you'd bring that one on top of it, put your glue on it, and that joint will be invisible when you sand it. So I wish I thought to bring another to show you the scarf joint, but I thought I could explain it without doing that. So I hope you got something out of that, and I want to thank everybody for watching the show today. I really enjoyed it. There's never enough time to talk about this stuff, like I said. So maybe we'll do a show up and coming on a little more intense on moldings and applications of different moldings, things like that. But again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email. My email address is finisheddimensions@yahoo.com, and you can visit my website, www.finisheddimensions.com. And again, this show is one of many we've done, and I want to thank all the viewers in all the towns that watch the show. Thank you for your comments, and I appreciate everybody watching the show. And I hope that you can watch us in the future. We got more shows planned. Again, if there's something you'd like us to do, a show maybe, a topic, something we could talk about, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching. You're watching Around the House. I'm your host, Steve O'Brien. See you next time.
When some people struggle with their mortgage payments, they become frozen, petrified. Not knowing what to do, they do nothing. But the people who do something, the people who take action, are far more likely to get the most positive outcome. Making home affordable is a free government program. Call now to talk one-on-one with a housing expert about the options that are right for you. Real help, real answers, right now.